Camera cranes and jibs are used extensively in Hollywood to get fluid movements on a large scale. Although you can achieve some of the same movements with a gimbal, you can't go as high and it will never be as smooth. You can get camera jibs online, but the good quality options are super expensive and the cheaper ones are limited in what they can do. And that's why I decided to make my own. I love building useful things that also save me money, and a camera crane like this will be useful for a lot of projects. I built mine using 3D printed parts and aluminum tubes, which give a pretty professional looking result. I made my jib 8 feet long, but if you decide to build your own, you can make it any length just by cutting the aluminum tubes shorter. I'll make the 3D files available to you guys along with a list of the hardware needed to complete the project. So let's jump into the build. First, you have to 3D print your parts.
I always recommend using PETG as it's more resistant to heat and impacts than PLA, and it costs about the same. I printed everything at 0.3mm layer height with a 50% gyroid infill and 3 walls. Once all your parts have been printed, you should be left with the camera base plate, the counterweight base plate, 2 X connectors, 4 T connectors, 2 tripod mount walls, a tripod mount base, and a top plate. Also a weight support, 2 90-degree connectors, 2 handles, a weight lock, and 3 knobs. As for hardware, you'll need a fluid head with a 3/8 hole underneath. You'll also need a Manfrotto style base plate, 2 8 feet long aluminum tubes, 1 10-inch long tube, 2 8-inch long tubes, and 2 4-inch long tubes. Next, you'll need 2 1-inch long 1/4-20 screws and nuts, and a 1-inch long 1/4-20 bolt with a nut, and a 1/2-inch long 3/8 bolt. You'll also need 2 1 3/4-inch long 1/4-20 bolts, 18 40mm long M6 screws, 6 5-inch long 5/8 threaded rods, 12 5/8 nylon insert nut, and finally 1 cold shoe adapter. And I forgot about the 12 skateboard bearings. To cut the threaded bars to length, I used a hacksaw, and I filed the cut edge before making sure the threads are still intact. As for the aluminum tubes, I cut them with a pipe cutter. I found it's the best option to get a clean result without making a mess. Let's start assembling the jib, starting with the tripod mount. Insert the 2 1/4-20 nuts in the tripod mount base. Then flip the part over and secure the Manfrotto base plate with 2 1/4-20 screws. Once that's done, screw on the first wall with 3 M6 screws. Before adding the other wall, insert the 4 bearings needed in place. You might need some heat and a clamp to push the bearings in place. Now attach the remaining wall. Once that's done, attach the top brace using 4 more M6 screws. And here is the first finished part. Before assembling anything else, prepare 2 of the knobs by inserting the longer 1/4-20 bolts. You should end up with this. Moving on to the counterweight assembly, insert 2 8-inch tubes in the counterweight base. Add the weight support on the other end and mark the position of the 4 holes. After drilling them out, attach the tubes to the weight support piece. Now take the 10-inch long tube and make a mark in the center. Drill it out and screw the part in place. You should be left with this. Moving on to the handles, I already drilled the holes. Insert the 90-degree connector on the 4-inch tube. Screw it on and do the same for the handle piece. Repeat the same steps for the other handle assembly. Now add the handles on the weight support assembly, mark the position of the holes and drill them out. Then screw the parts in place and you're done. Moving on to the counterweight support base, insert the 4 bearings in the hole. Once again, you might need some force to push them in place. When you're done, you can attach that part to the weight support assembly. And that's when I broke apart. Because the weight pushes down on this part, the top doesn't need to be super strong, so I decided to just sand the surface, glue it back together, and add a piece of flex tape and move on. Take out the nubs from earlier and screw them on the counterweight base. Now the whole counterweight assembly is done. Let's make the weight lock assembly. Insert a 1/4-20 nut in the weight lock. Then insert a 1-inch long 1/4-20 bolt in the knob. After that, screw the knob in place and you're done. Here's how to add weight to the assembly. Unscrew the 2 knobs from the counterweight base. Then slip on the weight lock on the bottom tube of the weight support assembly. Add the required weight on the same tube and reattach the counterweight base part. Now simply push the weights to the front and lock them in place. Moving on to the fluid head assembly, insert the 4 remaining bearings in the holes of the camera base plate. Next, push the 3/8 bolt in one of the hex holes on the same part and screw on your fluid head. And now your camera base assembly is finished. Before moving on to the next step, take out your 6 threaded rods and screw on a nylon insert nut on only one end of each rod. You'll also need all of the connectors and your 8 feet tubes. This is what you need to assemble next. Insert a T-joint in one end of each tube, followed by an X-joint 32 inches further down and another T-joint on the other end. Make sure all of the holes on the connectors are perfectly in line and tape them in place so they don't move out of alignment. Next, simply drill the holes through the tubes. It's finally time for the final assembly. Take out your tripod and put the center assembly on it. Next, push the first tube through and line up the X connector with the top hole. Screw a threaded rod in place and add a nylon insert nut on the other side. Don't tighten it too much as you want the tube to pivot smoothly. Repeat the same steps for the other tube, and move on to the counterweight assembly. Attach it to the short side of the jib. Simply repeat the same steps as for the center assembly. And finally, do the same for the camera base assembly. After putting the fluid head back on and adding the right amount of weight for your camera, all that's left to do is to add a culture adapter over your handles to add a monitor, put your camera on the jib, and you're good to go. Setting up the jib takes less than 5 minutes. Take out your tripod, attach the jib arm on top, slide on the weights and attach the assembly to your jib, lock the weights in place, and after adding your camera and monitor, you can make super creative shots.
So now that we have a completed camera crane, let's see the kinds of shots that you can get with it. This project was a lot of fun and it has so much potential for upgrades and modifications. I'm aware that the design isn't perfect, especially for heavy camera rigs like this one, but it's a good base to evolve from. What would be epic would be to attach a gimbal to the front of the jib to get a lot more movement options from the setup. You could also control the gimbal with your phone to add pans and tilts to your shots. If you want to make this project, you can find all the hardware on Amazon, the aluminum tubes at pretty much any hardware store, and the rest is just 3D printed. The files are available over in my Etsy store for just a couple of bucks, and the link is in the description below. This is all I have for you today, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.